I'm Kaitlyn Kane.
I'm Dickey. We are giving our senior speech. I wish we could say this is going to be a little more lighthearted, but it's not.
But before we start, we just want to say happy birthday to Elise because
we love you.
It's her 18th birthday today.
So this is called Making a Case for Stories, or Why You Should Like Catcher in the Rye.
And just to let you know, there might be slight spoilers for Catcher in the Rye and Infinite Jest ahead, but really, how much can you spoil those novels? Like, life is hard.
And sad. When we sat down to write this speech, it was the day that J.D. Salinger died. In fact, we sat down to write this speech because J.D. Salinger died. Middle schoolers, for those of you who don't know him, Salinger wrote The Catcher in the Rye, a classic young adult novel. The main character of the story is Holden Caulfield, a perpetually trash-talking, angst-ridden teenage boy. Catcher in the Rye has always been a controversial book. I find that people either love it or hate it, always in an extreme. I think it's easy to dislike Holden because he is this lonely, awkward kid, perpetually on the outside of his own life. You might find his constant whining and his complaining tiresome or pathetic, but all Holden is trying to do is cure his loneliness, and we cannot fault him for that. The world may not have heard from J.D. Salinger since before we were born, but his death hurt, perhaps more than it should have. I find that losing the man behind Holden Caulfield is a bit like losing Holden himself. Some of you would celebrate this, of course, not Salinger's death, but you're hoping you can finally put Holden to rest, never to be spoken of again. But this can't happen.
John Green is a favorite author of ours, and on his video blog, he spent a long time talking about why Catcher in the Rye is important. In one video, he said, "To those of you who say that Holden Caulfield is unlikable, I regret to inform you that you are also unlikable. So am I. Holden Caulfield is not the guy you want to be or the guy you want to be with. He's not Edward Cullen, but he is the guy that you secretly know yourself to be."
The thing is, we are all lonely people. Not always obviously, not on the surface, but we are. If you try to tell me that, somewhere inside of yourself, you're not lonely, I'm going to tell you that you're lying. Loneliness isn't so obvious as not having someone to talk to. Loneliness exists in all of us because we are not mind readers. We cannot become other people. In Song of Myself, Walt Whitman spoke of us as leaves of grass, connected by our roots. "I am vast, and I contain multitudes," he said. But sadly, this is far from the reality we know. At the end of the day, we are trapped within our singular selves. In the real world, we suffer alone.
And overcoming this loneliness is extremely hard to do because as humans, we just simply aren't capable of complete empathy. Sympathy is possible, of course, but feeling bad for someone isn't the same as really empathizing. That is to say, completely and fully understanding every facet of another person's existence. And this is actually a good thing, because our brains are just too primitive to be able to cope with feeling everyone's loneliness and everyone's pain and everyone's joy. But this limitation does mean that it's impossible to know what it's like to be another person, to know what they think and feel. But despite of this, we try anyways. Later in Whitman's life, 12 years after he wrote of humanity as Leaves of Grass, he took a different stand, one that I think is more true to life. He wrote this poem called Noiseless Patient Spider, the second stanza of which reads, "And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, to the bridge you will need be formed, to the ductile anchor hold, to the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul."
Whitman is recognizing that we are not born knowing each other, and that finding connection is hard. It's the struggle of a lifetime. This loneliness, a gap that is nearly unbridgeable, this is loneliness. What is wonderful and awful about us is that we not only feel this gaping chasm every day of our lives, but we constantly try to throw ourselves across it. In Noiseless Patient Spider, Whitman's really hitting on a problem intrinsic to the human condition. We are conscious of that unbridgeable gap between people, but we have no way to overcome it. For us, our awareness of this gap exists in our attempts to fit in. We believe that if we act like those around us, we will be accepted and understood. We want desperately to connect to the world, but we are also terrified of failure. We do not want to appear different or like an outsider, as Holden does. We become obsessed with how others see us, and we are paralyzed by the possibility of misspeaking or looking stupid. Some of us are satisfied with simply fitting in, but I believe that most of us do not want to be one of many for the rest of our lives. We want to be ourselves, but we are still afraid of standing out and being left alone. So what can we do to fight loneliness without losing ourselves?
We can look for guides, examples of success. If we're lucky, we can look to our parents and family. or we can look to television and pop culture, or we can look to books. I will never be one to argue that television isn't a good medium for stories, because I do love television, but books offer us something that we can't find from any other source, and that they let us into the characters' heads. We can see what they're thinking and feeling, read of their pain and limitations and joy in a way that's easily accessible. This is almost unique to the medium of the written word, and offers us an unparalleled look at the minds of people. This is why I think we look up to authors, why we care so much when we lose one. Through their stories, they show us how to be human. At this time of our lives, this is especially important because as teenagers or teenagers-to-be, we spend most of our time trying to figure out how to be people, whether we're aware of it or not. There's a sociologist named Peter Berger, and he said, "The difference between dogs and people is that dogs know how to be dogs." Dogs, unlike people, have this innate ability to know what it is that dogs are supposed to do. They don't need therapists or television to show them. They know their job, and they know what their relationship with other dogs are meant to be. Somewhere along the path of evolution, humans lost this. We need help to understand it. What we need is authors.
There is another author who is really influential to this speech, David Foster Wallace. We were introduced to him by John Green, who had a character in one of his own stories, Meet Wallace. Curious, we began to read his work, and he quickly became one of our favorite authors. David Foster Wallace is so important to us because of his unique way with dealing with loneliness and pain. He was brutally honest in his descriptions of loss and depression, so honest that it sometimes hurt to read. But his stories were never without hope. The main character of his magnum opus, Infinite Jest, is Hal, a teenager at a tennis academy. Hal is an extreme example of isolation. By the end of his story, he is so lost that he literally cannot communicate with others. But he never stops trying. Some of his last words in the book are, "I am in here." David Foster Wallace's books were guides to fighting loneliness. In Infinite Jest, one of the great realizations is that no single moment is unendurable. The thing is, in 2008, David Foster Wallace killed himself. He had struggled with depression for 20 years and spent much of those years writing about it and gave so many of his readers hope in the process. And then he was dead, and his readers, we were left reeling. There was this sense of the enemy in Wallace's stories, the specter of depression and darkness. There was this awful feeling that this thing had finally won against him. Jonathan Franzen, a writer and good friend of Wallace's, commented that many would say that a lovely, talented personality fell victim to severe chemical imbalance in his brain. There was the person of Dave, and then there was the disease, and the disease killed the man as surely as cancer might have. This story is both sort of true and totally inadequate. I will not pretend to understand David Foster Wallace's suicide, but I do believe that at the end of his life, he stopped trying to connect with his friends and family. When his friends tried to call him in the deepest parts of his depression, he stopped answering the phone. There is this feeling of doubt that creeps in when I think about his work against the backdrop of his death. Wallace spent much of his life writing about how to fight loneliness, and suddenly he lost his own battle. I can't help but wonder why his own stories could not help him. What if, at the end of his life, David Foster Wallace found that his words did not ring true?
But this is all wrong. What is actually so remarkable about David Foster Wallace is that he fought for 20 years against crippling depression, and that he was able to write about the horrors he faced in a way that resonates deeply. But most importantly, David Foster Wallace's death does not change the way we read his work. Even after 2 years, we still mourn David Foster Wallace, but his goodness, his best self, still exists in his writing. His death does not undo Hal's attempts at connection. And just because J.D. Salinger's dead doesn't mean that Holden's struggles are any less relevant. Because death, even suicide, can't invalidate words. And it is not the author that gives life to stories. It's us. I mean, we can't expect authors to do everything, to do all of the empathizing for us. All they can do is give us the tools to connect through the things we share. Images, characters, ideas, stories. They can give us that. But it is up to us to take these tools, these spheres, and use them to form the bridge, as Whitman wrote. And we form this bridge by talking about books and getting excited about stories and characters and giving life to words.
Reading books, talking about books, these are how we keep stories alive. I will admit some bias here because Kaitlyn and I are both writers, but I think if we've driven one point home, it's that authors don't last forever. Just reading and studying books isn't enough. I find that I'm often surprised by how many of us kids, teenagers, whatever, how many of us are writers? And that's a good thing. That's a great thing, really, because the world needs more writers. We can't simply sit back in English class and expect authors to tell all the stories for us. We need to tell our own stories. We need to write them down and let others see them, because while we can connect to Holden and the other readers of Catcher in the Rye, we can, I would argue, do it even better through our own stories. And I'm not saying you should write down your life story and submit it to excerpt, but I am saying that you should try saying something, anything. Tell a story, any story, and invariably, you'll be telling your own story too. And this is fantastic, because if people take the time to read stories, talk about stories, write their own stories, then we get a real glimpse of each other, beyond the facades, the lies, and the nonsense. If there is a cure to loneliness, it is the word. The written word, the spoken word, the word that is read. So please, please, we're asking you for 3 simple things. You can do it for an author you love. You can do it for us. You can do it for yourself. But please, read more, write more, speak more. Thank you. Seniors.